Hello to all our listeners. This is Priyam from Economic and Political Weekly hosting this episode of the EPW Research Radio. Today we have with us Professor Sreenath VS and Professor Mini Chandran. Professor Sreenath VS teaches at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He obtained his PhD from IIT Kanpur and is the recipient of the prestigious Meenakshi Mukherjee Memorial Prize for the year 2022 by the Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. He is also the author of An Introduction to Indian Aesthetics, History, Theory, and Theoreticians, which he's co authored with Professor Chandran, and another book called Sanskrit Poetics in the Postcolonial Space Beyond the Canon, both published by Bloomsbury. Professor Mini Chandran teaches at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Kanpur. She specializes in literature and censorship, translation studies, Indian literature, and literary theory. She is the author of The Writer, The Reader, and the State Literary Censorship in India, which is published by Sage. She's widely published across English and Malayalam journals, magazines, and newspapers. We welcome you both to the podcast. Today, our aim is to dissect their article titled To Write Was to Sense Kāvyaśāstra and Creative Freedom in Pre-Modern India, which is published as a special article in Economic and Political Weekly. So, I want to start this podcast by asking you to give us a brief overview of the idea of Kavya Shastra so that our audience can get a better idea of this field of knowledge. And to what specific time period does Indian poetics, especially Kavya Shastra, refer to?
Uh, Thank you, Priyam, for such a wonderful introduction. So, when we think about Sanskrit Kāvyaśāstra, the first thing that we need to talk about is the idea of Shastra itself. So, when we say Shastra, we are not just talking about a book or a text, it's actually much broader than that. So, according to scholars like Patrick Olivell, the term Shastra signifies at the same time a discipline and a treatise. So, what that means is it's both a system of knowledge a person would try to master, and at the same time, it's also the text that codifies that knowledge. So, a person would study it, then memorize it, and understand it. So, now Shastra played a major role across different fields, whether it was ethics and morality with Dharma Shastra, or sex with Kama Shastra, drama with Natya Shastra, sculpture with Shilpa Shastra, or astrology with Jyoti Shastra, or even salvation with Moksha Shastra. So essentially, the goal of Shastra was to prevent any deviation from accepted norms, especially in terms of human practices. So this is something Sheldon Pollock often highlights when he says that Shastra codified both positive and negative regulations to keep practices often on track. So now when it comes to literature or Kavya, we see the Shastric tradition emerging around the 7th century CE. From that point onwards, until the beginning of colonialism in the 17th century, Kāvyaśāstra tradition played a very, very crucial role in shaping the very ethos or the form and the aesthetics of literature. So Shastric tradition often rules, the creation of literature in this vast cultural zone, and that's how Shastra in various forms help define what was acceptable practice in multiple areas of knowledge. If we dive into the core inquiry of Kavya Shastra, we can definitely say that it's really about understanding the Sharira or the body of a literary work, and it's also an attempt to reveal its Atma or soul through a very structured, systematic approach. Now, something interesting about this is how practitioners of aesthetics, no matter their specific field, generally agreed on one key idea. And that key idea is that the body and soul of an aesthetic object are absolutely different from their representation in everyday life. That doesn't mean that there was no debate or disagreement. In fact, Indian aesthetic tradition is rich with discussions and differences on the nature of both the Sharira and Atma of a work of art. For instance, Amaha, who is considered the founding father of literary theory in Sanskrit, in his work Kavyalankara often looks closely at the Kavi Sharira or the body of a literary work and says that Alankara or poetic ornamentation is the very core or soul or Atma of Kavya. But not everyone agreed with Pamaha. For example, Vamana in his text Kavya Alankara Sutravurti starts with a chapter titled Kavya Sharira Nirnaya, which literally translates into the examination of the body of Kavya, argues that Riti or style is actually the soul of Kavya. And then there is Anandavardhana who offers a different view altogether. For him, the soul of Kavya is actually Dhvani or poetic suggestion. So he emphasizes the role of Dhvani, which goes beyond just the literal. Another example I can give is actually Vakrokti Jivita, written by Kundaga, where Kundaga says that Vakrokti is actually the soul of Kavya. So if you look at the core enquiry of Kāvyaśāstra tradition, we can definitely say that it was a very strong attempt to understand what was the nature of Kavya Sharira and what was the soul of Kavya, or what made a piece of writing a literary work. This was primarily the core enquiry of Kāvyaśāstra tradition, to put it,
Mm. If I
simply.
may just interrupt, like
Yeah.
a term that we often hear in connection with Kāvyaśāstra, if I'm not wrong, is Natya Shastra. Are they interconnected in some way or are they different?
Natya Shastra is just one of the Shastras. So,
Mhm.
what I mean, uh, one of the things in ancient Indian literary, especially Sanskrit literary tradition, is that everything is referred to as a Shastra, which today we might translate that as science. So, it's not really science in the modern sense of the word, but it is divided into various. So one is Kavya Shastra. Natya Shastra was essentially a treatise, a sort of manual, a guideline for stage performances. So in those days, the major genre, so to speak, was Natya, which is basically dance and drama combined. There is no other way to define it. I would say, to put it very simply, it is more or less somewhat like our contemporary Bollywood movies or Indian movies. It has a bit of everything. There is dramatics, there is dance, there is spectacle, there is music. So the Indian concept of drama is implicit. I mean, all of this is connected, deeply interconnected in the Indian tradition. So Natya Shastra essentially was that. But at the same time, it was also a philosophical attempt to understand, uh, the what goes beyond the dramatic performance. So everything in ancient Indian tradition is connected at some level to some aspect of spirituality. So Natya Shastra is all of these combined. I think it's a very unique work if you look at it across the world. I don't think we have anything like that in any other part of the world, honestly speaking. Now, we do have Aristotle's Poetics, which talks about the fundamental principles of drama, etc. But Natya Shastra is in a class of its own, I would say. So, it is not to be conflated with the Kavya Shastra, but maybe it can be subsumed under the rubric of Kavya Shastra.
So, like, what can then we say is the primary aim of Kavya Shastra, and what really was the role of the creative writers? Were they allowed to let their imagination loose to express whatever they want, or would you say that the Sanskrit poetics provided the poet with creative freedom to write whatever they wanted and speak truth to power, or was it otherwise?
Uh, that is an interesting question. The thing is that if we look at the history of classical Sanskrit literature, or any, I mean, not just Sanskrit literature, but Prakrit or any of the other Abhabramshas or the other languages that were there in India in the ancient times, one striking thing is that we do not see any overt cases of censorship, as you would call it today. Right? So we don't see examples of writers being persecuted or thrown into jail or executed for whatever they've written, which is not the case if we look at the West, because from the first century CE onwards, we have writers like Ovid being banished for writing something for offending the king. Plato said that in his works, he said that writers should be banned from the ideal republic because literature corrupts. This attitude does not seem to be prevalent in ancient India. Now, the question is, yes, it would be great to claim that, yes, the writers had all the freedom and that India provided enough creative freedom and all of it, but we need to take that with a pinch of salt, right? Why is it that we do not find these very overt cases of censorship? So, one of the reasons perhaps was that Kāvyaśāstra had these very rigid rules and regulations about composition and appreciation of literature, which did not allow writers internalize these regulations so much that it did not allow them to transgress or overstep boundaries, so to speak. So the writer, for one thing, the writer had these regulations in place. The other was a system of patronage. So most of the poets, especially in those days, we do not have many prose writers. We had mostly poets or dramatists, were under the employ of the king. They were court poets. So the patronage of the king effectively meant that they could not really write against the king. They could not cut the hand that fed them, right? So there was no question of going against the king. That was one reason. The other reason is that we had so many concepts of literary composition, as I already said. Auchitya is one of the major principles, which is the concept of propriety, which really laid down the rules for how to write, what is the correct diction, what sort of themes you could deal with, what language you could use, what exactly constitutes good literature. So if you do not fit into these regulations, then that meant that you are not a good writer. Not just that you are offensive. Being offensive is still fine if you're acknowledged as a good writer. For example, Salman Rushdie is a good writer. I mean, he's offending a whole lot of people, but everybody agrees that he's a good writer. Whereas to be classified as a bad writer, I mean, no writer worth his salt would want to be classified as a bad writer. So obviously, they had to fit into these regulations, which effectively meant that they could not produce literature that was radically offensive or transgressive in that sense. So this perhaps could explain why we do not have any overt forms of censorship. So, writers, to answer your question, writers, were they free to express whatever that was on their minds? I don't think so. Maybe they found very intelligent ways of expressing what they wanted to express.
I'd like to further look into this idea of auchitya, like which you're saying is what made these authors conform to the established norms of society. Like, can you tell us how this transitioned into like a self-regulating principle for these writers and defined the sort of meta-narrative of the ontology of literature as you write in your paper?
The idea, the concept of aujitya is actually a very overarching concept, I would say. Throughout the tradition of Kāvyaśāstra, one can very clearly see aujitya there as a very strong force upon the very, the very psyche of the author. So aujitya in Kāvyaśāstra maybe can be translated as propriety in English. It's a very rough translation. You can call it either propriety or decorum. But it's much more than just a simple sense of what is proper or fitting. Auchitya is really about shaping the subjectivity of an individual within a society, as Professor Chandran rightly pointed out. It's like a set of guidelines that tell us how to behave or how to interact or even how to present ourselves in different contexts. Think about it, every society has these codes. We have unwritten rules about how to address our elders, or what to wear at a formal event, or even how to go about writing a PhD thesis. But what's key here is that these notions of propriety or auchitya are set by always the dominant groups in society. They define these norms, and quite often they expect everyone else to follow them. Now, when we turn to Sanskrit literary theory or Kāvyaśāstra, the idea of Aujitya has been very, very central, like the theory of Rasa. In fact, it became a formalized literary concept in the 11th century through Kshemendra's work Aujitya Vichara Charcha. That's the first text to systematically reflect upon the idea of Aujitya or decorum in literary studies. So in Kāvyaśāstra, Aujitya serves primarily two functions. First, it acts as a guideline for writers, setting models for how to represent character types and emotions appropriately. And secondly, it functioned by a kind of censoring role, where writers are expected to avoid depicting situations where an otherwise noble character might behave improperly or out of line with their social role. The second mechanism was often invoked whenever they were actually retelling an already existing story. Based on how closely a character often aligned with the idea of Aujitya, literary critics categorized characters into three groups: the Uttama or the noble, the middling or the Madhyama, and the inferior or the Athama. The noble characters always upheld Aujitya, while the middling characters occasionally lapsed into anaujitya, and the inferior characters, on the other hand, mostly ignored the idea of propriety that society expected. Writers were often given pretty clear guidelines on how each character type should express various emotions. For example, if you look at Hasya Rasa, the emotion of humor, the way it was portrayed depended on the character's type. A noble character would express humor through soft or moderate laughter. A middling character, on the other hand, might show humor through louder, more obvious laughter and even some ridicule. But when it came to inferior characters, they would go all out with rowdy, boisterous, and even obscene laughter. So the message was very clear. Noble characters were to be admired and emulated, while the middling and the inferior ones served as often, cautionary tales. The second way in which Aujitya functioned, which involved making sure that even noble characters who might slip in a story were edited or stay proper. This was particularly true when writers were retelling well known stories, as I mentioned before. A very important text in this regard is actually Bhoja's Sringara Prakasha. Bhoja, in his Sringara Prakasha, gives us some interesting examples where creative writers stepped in to clean up any improper actions of noble characters. Take the Ramayana, for example. Originally, Rama is exiled to the forest by his father Dasharatha because of a promise he made to his wife Kaigeyi. But in the play Nirgosha Dasharatha, they wrote the scene in such a way that it wasn't Dasharatha himself who exiled Rama, but a magical creature disguised as him. Why this happened? Because it didn't seem right for a noble king like Dasharatha to send his virtuous son away. Similarly, in the Ramayana, Rama kills Valin by shooting him from behind a tree, something considered less than honorable. In the play Mahavira Charita, however, the writers reimagine the scene in such a way that Rama fights Valin in a fair face to face duel. So we see the same kind of rewriting in the Mahabharata too, if you look at it. Bhima, after killing Dushasana, we all know that drinks his blood. It's often a very brutal act. But in Bhattanarayana's Veni Samhara, this act is reassigned to a creature from the underworld, not Bhima himself, which keeps Bhima's nobility intact. Then there is a well known story of Dushyanta and Shakuntala in the Mahabharata, where the story was originally taken from. Dushyanta forgets Shakuntala because his love for her is shaky. He is often portrayed as a womanizer. But in Kalidasa's Abhijnana Shakuntala, he forgets her due to a curse from the sage Durvasa, uh, making it quite a supernatural issue, not a flaw in Dushyanta's character. So, what's important to note here is that Sanskrit tradition rarely stayed away from these ideas about how characters and emotions should be portrayed. Writers followed these conventions closely because of Kavishiksha, the training of the poets. The training of the poet or Kavishiksha was essential for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously as a poet, no matter how naturally talented a writer was. They were really expected to go through formal training in how to compose poetry. And a big part of the training was learning about aujitya or propriety. So, in this way, aujitya isn't just about personal conduct, it's deeply embedded in how literature is actually crafted and received, ensuring that characters and their actions and emotions all align well with a broad sense of what is fitting or proper in a given cultural context. So this is the idea of Aujitya, especially, I mean, a very brief outline of the idea of Aujitya in Sanskrit Kāvyaśāstra.
I just want to take a moment to ask you about who gets to be a Kavi and how really, who he's writing for, who's really being left out in the stories. Can we spend a minute or two on Sanskrit literature and who this was for and who it was leaving out in the process of being this way?
I think that, see, we have to think of multiple contexts when you're talking about that. Because it's not just Sanskrit that produced literature. In fact, there is a theory that Prakrit literature predated Sanskrit literature. So, one theory is that Sanskrit, or the refined version of the language, evolved from the Prakrit. So, Panini's Ashtadhyayi, for example, which is a 4th century BCE text, has references to Prakrit texts. So, now who were the people who spoke Sanskrit? Is an interesting question. Whether it was at all a language used by the common man in everyday language, or was it a language that, I mean, somewhat comparable to English today, the language of the elite used for administrative purposes and for liturgical purposes. So, was Sanskrit at all then the language of the ordinary person? If you look at Sanskrit drama, we find that it is an elite language, because only the king, only the Kshatriya and the Brahmin characters were allowed to use Sanskrit in place. Women, for example, women or again lower caste characters could only use Prakrit. So Dushyanta speaks in Sanskrit and Shakuntala responds in Prakrit. But obviously they understood each other, right? So it was, there was communication possible. So who did they exclude then? Is We are not very sure about that, because these plays, again I'm going to that categorization of the various 10 categorizations according to Natyashastra. That is, Nataka is a play composed in Sanskrit, and that is essentially meant for upper classes. So whether this was an egalitarian audience, I doubt that. Whether there were women among the audience, again I doubt, because Sanskrit was, as you understand, a whole lot of the population was denied the use of Sanskrit. So the Nataka largely focused on upper caste, upper class men. So the hero had to be of a certain type, right? So it was a perfect hero who was valiant, brave, combined all sorts of virtues in him, etc. And the only two rasas that the Nataka could evoke were the Veer rasa and the Shringar rasa. So that sort of automatically preempts the topics that you can deal with. You can't deal with a whole lot of things. But for that, you had other subgenres of drama. So you had the Dima, the Iha, Mriga, Vyayoga, etc., etc. And perhaps the Prahasana, the Vidhi, and the Bhana were the ones that would come closest to what is the stand up comedy today, or the street plays of today. So they were more egalitarian, because these plays allowed criticism. So in these plays, they could criticize Brahmins, for example, which was an absolutely no in those days. You couldn't touch Brahmins. But in the Prahasana or the Vidhi or the Bhana, you could do that. And this was meant for the masses, or the riffraff, as you would call it today. So in a way, somewhat like the difference between, say, an art film, like a Satyajit Ray film, and a Varun Dhawan sort of film. So the audience was different. So to say that it excluded certain people would perhaps be unfair. Now, who could become a Kavi again? Obviously, it had to be a male, it had to be upper caste, it had to be upper class, because they wrote in Sanskrit. Because all the people that we know invariably were either Brahmins or Kshatriyas, or the upper classes. I don't think that we had an author who belonged to lower caste in Sanskrit, that is. Prakrit is a different matter, as I said. I'm not very sure. Perhaps Sreenath could add to
Yes.
it.
So I'm not sure when the idea of when the insistence on Kavi Shiksha in fact started, because if you look at the Adi Kavya, the Ramayana, you will see that the poet was naturally inspired. He did not undergo any typical training or anything. The same goes with Kalidasa. He was a shepherd originally and then was blessed to become a poet. But as far as the Kāvyaśāstra tradition is concerned, from the 7th century onwards, one can see this insistence. In fact, Bhamaha in his Kavyalankara very clearly says that one could be encouraged to become a poet only after undergoing proper training in the art of poetic composition. So I could often find this rupture because in the beginning of the common era, you can find out one naturally becoming a poet, right? Valmiki actually chances upon a hunter killing a mating pair of birds, and he gets overcome with grief, and naturally the shloka comes out of his mouth, which later on gets sanctioned by Brahma, and he says that what you have produced is shloka and you can go ahead with it. You can start composing the story of Rama in the literary form you have just created. So it's a very natural production. The same goes with Kalidasa as far as the story that we know. He was originally a differently able or mentally challenged shepherd, and then he became a poet. I mean, we never get to see Kalidasa undergoing any particular poetic training or anything. But throughout the history of Sanskrit Kāvyaśāstra, the typical way characters and situations were represented was primarily maintained through a process called Kavishiksha, I would say, the formal training of poets. So the training was essential in the Sanskrit literary tradition. Experts in Kavyashastra often believed that even a naturally talented poet would be absolutely incomplete without proper education in the craft. While inborn talent or pratibha was often valued, the role of training or vyutpatti was also crucial in shaping a poet. From Bhamaha onwards, as I previously mentioned, writers stressed the importance of this formal training. Bhamaha claimed that you could only think about writing poetry after mastering all necessary texts. Dandin, Bhamaha's successor, even compared an untrained poet to a blind person who can't distinguish colors. Without training, a poet can't tell what makes poetry great. Dandin often noted that even someone without natural talent could excel in poetry through diligent training. So trained poets were encouraged to create works that align with societal norms. This training, to a great extent, served as a tool to ensure that poets followed conventional representations of characters and emotions, limiting the expression of alternative ideas. In fact, the nature of characters and their actions was often predetermined even before a poem was composed. If you want to portray a king, this is how you should portray a king. If you want to portray a Kulina woman, a noble woman, this is how you should be portraying her. So while the names and settings of characters might change from poem to poem, their portrayals were often guided by established rules of poetry. So this insistence on what was considered suitable in literature, from word choice to character traits, made it really difficult for poets to challenge the dominant cultural narratives of their time. In a sense, the training shaped not just the poets but also the stories they could actually tell. I mean, it's very evident from the examples that I have cited previously.
Yeah, and like you're saying, that literature sort of served a certain purpose and it had to invoke a certain rasa. So, can you tell us like this connection between rasa or rasa bhasha and auchitya?
Yeah. So in Sanskrit literature, there was this really strong push to create ideal models for every character type and emotions they should evoke. So when noble characters did something that went against the social or moral norms, critics often felt the need to clean it up or censor. So this was because any violation of these norms could lead to something called rasabhasa. So the word rasabhasa can be translated into English as semblance of rasa. In simple terms, it's when a specific emotion or sentiment is supposed to be experienced by the audience but fails to land because the emotion is directed in the wrong way or at an improper object. So the idea of Rasavasa, in fact, goes back to the 9th century critic named Utpada, who explained Rasabhasa as a sentiment expressed improperly. He even coined a special term Urjaswin for this. His example was very interesting. Shiva making an indecent advance towards Parvati before they were married. According to Utpada, this is an example of Rasabhasa. This is not expected of a character like Shiva. Shiva is a noble character. He shouldn't make an indecent advance towards Parvati before they were married. Abhinavagupta, for example, another major figure in literary theory, gives us a very famous example of Rasabhasa. So it's actually from the Ramayana. He says that Ravana's love for Sita in the Ramayana is an example of Rasabhasa. Ravana does all the right things to show love and desire. But because Sita is already married and is a divine figure, his love doesn't generate the proper romantic emotion. He does everything possible to produce Shringara Rasa, but it doesn't become Shringara Rasa for the readers or the audience, primarily because it is enacted by Ravana and that too towards Sita, who is married to Rama. So instead, so it falls into Rasabhasa. It's a failed or improper version of that emotion. But here is the interesting part. Rasabhasa wasn't always seen as a very bad thing. When it came to morally corrupt or regenerate characters, Rasabhasa was acceptable. So the goal of these literary theories was to guide writers on how to avoid this issue when creating noble or ideal characters. It was all about preserving the right emotional and aesthetic experience in literature. If we say that Anaujitya was absolutely discouraged in poetry, it's almost like saying that we should always have Ramayana without Ravana. We know that in a literary work, Anaujitya happens. That's how the conflict is actually generated in a work of art. So one shouldn't think that Anaujitya was absolutely banned in literary expressions. Anaujitya was actually encouraged uh, whenever they wanted to portray a villain, a character who was not really noble. But when it comes to the noble characters, you have to actually conform to the notion of Aujitya. So noble characters often emerge victorious at the end of the day. When the drama ends, when the poem ends, it is the noble character who is the embodiment of Aujitya who emerges victorious. What happens if the case is the other way around? What happens if a character who actually subscribes to all kinds of Anaujitya emerges victorious? It's actually kind of giving a very wrong message to the audience that even if you do Anaujitya in life, you can emerge victorious, you can be successful. They really wanted to avoid that. They always make sure that a character who follows Anaujitya fails and a character who actually follows the raw path of Aujitya emerges victorious. So it functioned almost like a symbolic power. They're not directly telling you what you should be doing, but by way of portraying a character who emerges victorious by following the path of Dharma, they were indirectly telling us that this is you have to do.
Just to add to it, I think also it depended a lot upon the skill of the writer, the artist, because basically what the concept of Anauchitya says is that, or the concept of rasabhasa, is that in the attempt to create a rasa, it shouldn't fall flat on its face, basically. So otherwise, it will backfire. So even today, if you think of it, this artistic principle holds true, right? If when you watch a film or you read a book, you really do not want the bad character to come out victorious. Ultimately, there is a moral principle that all creative writers stick to even today. So this is not such an outlandish concept as you would think it to be. It is still very much in force. The concept of Auchitya or Rasabhasa, although it sounds very ancient or whatever, it is still there. Because again, the concept of Auchitya should not be confused with the idea of the Greek concept of decorum, where the Greeks believed that certain things should not be shown on stage. That was their concept of decorum or propriety, whereas it is not at all that in the classical Sanskrit version. But so that is how it sort of influenced the reader's response to the work. No, it is molding their ethical and moral sensibility, so to speak.
One stock response we could find in all these Kāvyaśāstra texts was this act like Rama,
Mm,
not like Ravana.
yeah.
This is a statement which we could, find out in almost all these texts.
Yeah, and not surprising considering that obviously that is the moral that you want to uphold. So that holds true for, I think, even today that is true.
But I just want to ask, like, does this mean that anauchitya or impropriety was just not allowed in literature at all? And what role did it play in characterizing, like you mentioned, Ravan, characterizing villains through their transgression of societal norms and rewriting the occasional acts of impropriety in classical literature?
It's not as if it was not allowed, as Sreenath has already pointed out. In certain cases, there had to be an Auchitya because Ravana had to act that way. Otherwise, he will cease to be Ravana. Right? But there are times when this sort of verges on the, unacceptable. And one very famous or perhaps infamous example is Kumara Sambhavam, Kalidasa's, and especially the eighth canto, which is a very explicit description of the sexual relationship between Shiva and Parvati. So this was a matter of great debate, and Anandavarthana sort of whitewashed Kalidasa, saying that this is okay, it is acceptable because Kalidasa is such a great artist or a great writer, which is not really answering that question of whether this constitutes obscenity or whether this is anauchitya. Can you have, say, for example, the examples of anauchitya, that is, the other example that was cited was of Shiva making a sort of indecent pass at Parvati before marriage. If that is unacceptable, then how is this acceptable? Because Anandavarthana himself admits that it's a bit like, describing the sexual relationship between our parents. So to say that if the artist is great enough, it is okay, is sort of, not really an answer to it. So it's not as if there was no anauchitya. There was anauchitya there. It's not, the artists are fallible people after all. So that is there, but it was not, I mean, if you're asking whether it was met with, punishments or something like that, I don't think that that happened. Again, Srinath has anything to add?
Yes, as you rightly pointed out, it's almost like saying, I mean, it's not the case that Kāvyaśāstra mentions something and the poets very clearly followed everything.
Hmm.
So this was actually what was advised. That doesn't mean that all of them very keenly followed it. So in the paper, we were primarily looking at the way in which Kāvyaśāstra was actually conceiving this notion of censorship or silencing the poet. That does not mean that nobody ever committed an aujitya in the world of Sanskrit Kavya. People might have had, but Kavi never allowed it.
Hmm.
So we cannot say that there was always a one-to-one relationship between Shastra and the practice. Yeah.
It is just that the principles of literary craft sort of frowned upon it. But yes, of course, there were breaches made. I mean, there were people who did not stick to that. For various reasons, primarily because they were not good enough artists. That is one reason. Others could be that it was a deliberate choice. Say, for example, when you are talking about how good should be seen as triumphing and evil as being defeated, if you look at the plays of Bhasa, especially the Mahabharata plays, each of those plays has an anti-hero. So Urubhangam has Duryodhana as a central character, and you feel very sorry for Duryodhana. Duryodhana, I think this is the first ever attempt in that sense to portray Duryodhana in a sympathetic light. So obviously, Bhasa was not adhering to the concept of Auchitya. Right, and it's a wonderful play. All those plays are wonderful. We cannot say that they are bad because they are showing this.
It's a tragedy actually.
Yeah, and it is, yes, it is flouting another artistic principle, which is to show death on stage. Sanskrit drama does not have tragedies. We do not have plays that end in deaths. Bhasa violated that principle also. But to be maybe in to argue in Bhasa's favor would be that Bhasa wrote this much before these principles were formulated, so perhaps he was free of all these restrictions. We do not know.
Can we think about how the purpose of this sort of literature contributed to the maintenance of hierarchy and power within society. Would it be correct to see Kāvyaśāstra as a form of soft power?
Um, Maybe I think we will have to say that it was a soft power because it does not explicitly tell anybody to censor anything. But the very moment you go through Kavishiksha process, you end up being somebody who doesn't want to question the authority, because that's the whole purpose of Kavishastra, Kavishiksha. Because in Kavishiksha, you often say that you have to respect some people, you have to respect your elders, you have to look up to your king who is actually patronizing you. So how can you produce something which challenges the existing authority? So it often happened in a very interconnected manner. On the one hand, you have Kavishastra codifying all these rules, and then you have Kavishiksha where these principles are actually taught. Then you have a Kavi who has undergone the process of Kavishiksha, then a Kavya which actually conforms to all the dominant conceptions existing in society. So it's actually happening in a very interconnected manner. So there is no explicit interference as far as the creativity of the poet is concerned. But at the end of the day, you cannot actually produce, or you do not want to produce. I mean, even before producing a kavya, you often undergo a training which conditions you in a particular manner, which makes you think in a particular manner. Then how can you produce something which questions?
So such restrictions were unnecessary, so to speak,
Yes.
because it is inbuilt into the system of. So that is why we titled the paper "Writing Was Sensing," because as you write, you are censoring.
Yes.
So there is no need for an external censor. An external censor becomes redundant because what is coming out is already conditioned by, it has passed through so many filters at various levels, institutional as well as non-institutional. So then what you get is a very sanitized literature by the end of it. So there is no need for anything else, any other external restrictions.
But we've spoken a lot about the writer and the training of the writer, but were there any Kavya Shastra guidelines for the reader? Was the Who was the ideal reader? Or like as you write the Sahridaya, did the reader also contribute to this effectively embedding of censorship within the very fabric of literature?
Yeah, we would think so because the Sahridaya, literally the Sahridaya means somebody whose heart is beating in union with the writer. So that is a literal translation of the word Sahridaya. So the Sahridaya is essentially somebody who would understand the writer, be at the same wavelength. So that also means that this particular reader will never misunderstand what the writer is writing. Say, for example, today the major cases of censorship arise because the reader cannot understand what the writer is saying. So, it is the contextual differences, cultural differences, all of this is adding to it. But if the writer and the reader are at the same wavelength, then there is no question of this sort of misunderstanding occurring. And also, I mean, if this concept of Kavishiksha, there is also the concept of the Kavyanushilana. See, the what you call the Sahridaya is not just an ignorant reader. This is a reader who has undergone training in a very different sense. So again, we are talking about leisurely classes. We are talking about men who had a lot of time to spare, basically. So what they did was every day, they would read poetry. There would be people to teach them how to appreciate poetry. So these are maybe they're not writers themselves, but they are very well versed in, their connoisseurs in a certain sense. So these are very valuable readers, so to speak, almost like critics today. So the reader there is also contributing to this idea of what is good and what is bad in literature, what is acceptable and what is not, because they have very refined tastes. So this is where again that concept of the hierarchy, the stratified notion of the Natyashastra is putting forth. You have plays at different levels. The common, the Vidhi or the Bhana can afford to reach out to the common man, because it is a very different sort of audience it is reaching out to. There they can afford to criticize, they can afford to use language that is perhaps considered uncouth. Whereas the higher levels of literature, Nataka for example, it requires the refined taste of the very cultured, civilized Saharde. So that also ensures in a certain way that literature will not step out of line. In fact, most of the plays of Kalidasa, for example, start with this, when the beginning of the play, Kalidasa says that I am before a very elite audience, a privileged audience, so I have to be very careful in what I say or present. So there is that, formal acknowledgement of the viewer or the spectator or the reader.
Often poets say that, I want a Sahridaya, so that the poet, so that he can appreciate what I have written. For example, Kalidasa makes a very strong plea to Lord Brahma to spare him from the punishment of presenting his poem to an insensitive listener or arasiga. Arasigeshu kavitva nivedanam shirasi malika malika. uh, don't let me not be cursed to read my poem in front of an arasika. So there is this concept of what you call gunadosha nirupanam. Gunadosha nirupanam. So only a cultivated reader can actually understand what is wrong with the text and what are the merits of it. So I should be blessed enough to read out my poem in front of only such a Sakradaya. You can actually find out these expressions quite often in literary expressions.
Interesting. My final question to both of you is like, have these prescriptive guidelines effectively segued into contemporary methods of censorship, according to you?
No, I don't think so, because see, what happened was that with colonization, there was a very clean rupture with our ancient traditions of creativity and literature. So what we have at present is the colonial legacy of or the legal legacy, what was earlier the Indian Penal Code and now the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita. So legal punishment for writing something, that is a new concept, and that is intrinsically associated with the concept of printing, right? So print culture brought in the concept of banning. Banning in the sense that we understand it today was not there. It would be very nice if these ancient principles sort of, as you say, segued into present day practices, because one of the fundamental problems that we face today in censorship cases, especially, is that people do not understand the context in which the writer is writing. As I said, if you had more Sahridayas today, perhaps there wouldn't be so many problems with literature, right? So what is, say, a text is not, it's not meant for everybody. Maybe this is a very elitist and a classist thing to say, but think about the context from which that writer is writing and why he or she is writing it, then the reception would be different. Now the problem is people are not, they think that literature is meant for everybody, which is true, I'm not denying that either, but maybe these classifications might help, right? So a literary text, what is a poem or a novel, it is not attempting to portray reality as reality. No, it is not the truth as you see it, or as somebody else understands it. So there is a different way in which it should be perceived. If these notions of the Sahridaya and these classical notions came into the contemporary times, that would be great. And in fact, the reader also, the Sahridaya should be, the reader should become a Sahridaya, should become a responsible reader. Do not jump to conclusions the minute you read something. So like the writer, the reader also has responsibilities, so which is what the ancient concept of Sahridaya implied.
Professor Sreenath, would you like to add to that?
Yes, that's what I'm also thinking, because it has nothing to do with the way in which we understand the idea of censorship in modern times. It was a different system altogether. That said, we cannot say that anything which was going against the decorum was not encouraged at all. Sometimes there could be subversive attempts. For example, in the case of 20, it's a very indirect way of challenging the authority. It's not very explicit. uh, as Professor Chandran rightly pointed out, only a Sahridaya can actually understand 20, what that poetic suggestion means. So this is what I also think. It's completely different from the modern form of censorship, which we are actually familiar with. It's a very covert way of conditioning the poet to produce kavya in a particular manner, so that it does not challenge the existing, authority. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Sreenath and Professor Chandran, for this extremely enriching session.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
You can access the article discussed in today's episode in the show notes. Thank you so much for tuning in to EPW's Research Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode and gained some valuable insights too. Help us keep the spirit of academic inquiry alive and subscribe to EPW today.